All right. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, folks. Steve and Kushmi, can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Perfect. Yeah. Good old audio issues. So, yep. Thank you everyone for joining. Wherever you are in the world, wherever you are connecting to your Cloud PC AVD or soon your AVD for Azure Stack HCI. We'll get into that in a bit. But thank you for joining our April edition. So before we dive in with our experts and before I have our experts introduce themselves, just wanted to cover some recent announcements for all of our products. First and foremost, we're going to cover the Azure Virtual Desktop for Azure Stack HCI today. In the general Azure Virtual Desktop for Azure news, we had a couple updates come in over the past month or two. One of them is the configuring remote desktop, the clipboard reader, the clipboard direction. That's public preview, so you can control whether content can be pasted only into the session host or only out of the session host. You can just configure any which way for that direction. So you can take a look at that documentation at the ak.ms/avd/clipboard transfer direction. And you can also find a lot of other news for Azure Virtual Desktop for everything we released in 2024 at the regular AVD What's New link, which is the ak.ms// What's New AVD. On the Windows 365 side, probably a little bit more news. We had this huge release with our partner just this month. HP Anywhere for Windows 365 Enterprise is now in public preview. So there's the blog there, ak.ms/w365 HP Anywhere blog, allowing customers, allowing you to have users log in and connect to the cloud PCs with PC over IP. If that's an experience and protocol that you're used to, that's available now in public preview. In terms of some management of your cloud PCs, maintenance windows are in public preview, so you can decide timeframes for different cloud PCs to take bulk actions. That way you're not disrupting users. That's at ak.ms/windows365/maintenance windows preview. In other management news, step up and resizing. If you have step up licenses, there are now options to support storage SKUs. So we have that documentation at ak.ms/windows365/step up licenses storage. And then the one last other piece is that Windows 365 has their first v1.0 API for Microsoft Graph. So that's really exciting. If you need to use production workloads and you need to use the production versions of Microsoft Graph to automate things, that is now available. So for other Windows 365 news and features, you can go ahead and check out ak.ms/w365 what's new. So back to the topic at hand, back to Azure Virtual Desktop for Azure Stack HCI. I'd like to introduce the guests that you see here. Kushmi, do you want to start?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for inviting. I'm Kushmeen. I'm a PM in Azure Edge infrastructure team, and my focus is Azure Virtual Desktop on Azure Stack HCI. Steve, do you want to go next?
Sure. Hey, everybody. I am Steve Downs. I am the product manager on the Windows Cloud Experience team responsible for Azure Virtual Desktop on Stack HCI. Kushmin and I work very closely together, collaborating on what we're talking about today.
Yeah, so Stephen Kushmi, I think a lot of folks here, we've been alternating between Azure Virtual Desktop, Windows 365, so I think folks have a probably better understanding of Azure Virtual Desktop. But can you both talk to us about Azure Stack HCI, what it is, how it's different from Azure, and all that good stuff?
Yeah, I can start with that, Steve. Feel free to chime in. So Azure Stack HCI is a hyper-converged infrastructure solution that Microsoft offers where you can run your Windows and Linux VMs or your containerized workloads and their storage, right? So it's a hybrid solution, which means you can connect your on-premises system to Azure and take advantage of Azure services and Azure infrastructure, right? Very recently, earlier this year, we have released the latest version of Azure Stack HCI, which is Azure Stack HCI 23H2. And with that release, you can now do cloud-based deployment of your Stack HCI clusters. You can do cloud-based update management of your clusters at scale, cloud-based monitoring, and then it also brings in all the infrastructure, all the Arc infrastructure that you need to provision and manage your workloads through Azure Resource Manager, right? So through Azure Portal, through Azure CLI, etc. Uh, in summary, it's think of it as an extended on-premises region for your Azure ecosystem.
That sounds good. And Kashmeen, I I think there's two questions that I have, and one of them is what does it mean to have this Azure Virtual Desktop for Azure Stack HCI, and then two, I guess, if what's kind of how does this fit into the journey of Azure Stack HCI? So Steve, if you could talk about the AVD for Azure Stack HCI, I think that'd be a good intro.
Absolutely. So Azure Virtual Desktop is simply a cloud-managed virtual desktop solution. The AVD service takes care of provisioning Azure Virtual Desktop session hosts, as well as logging users into those session hosts. And traditionally, since AVD was launched years ago, that was all contained within Azure. But with this AVD for Azure Stack HCI capability, all we've really done is extended the ability for customers to provision their virtual desktops down onto their own managed Stack HCI instances on premises, close to where their data is, whatever their use case might be for driving it. Maybe we'll get into that later. But also the nice thing about it is that that includes the full AVD capabilities, including Windows 11 multi-session on premises.
Got it. And when did Azure Stack HCI in general release, and how does this play into that journey?
So Azure Stack HCI is available in general availability for quite a while. You will see almost an annual release, right, for the service. The latest release, which is 23H2 release, was announced, became generally available earlier this year in February. And this is, I think, one of the biggest upgrade for the service for all the features I was mentioning earlier, right? So now you can deploy a cluster through Azure Portal or through templates, for example. You can manage your cluster through Azure Portal using Azure Update Manager. Also, you get uh, when your cluster gets deployed, you get automatically you're able to just go ahead and provision your VMs, your AKS cluster, and your AVD session host, right? So previously, Azure Stack HCI, all of these different components had to be installed kind of separately, but 23H2 brings in the OS plus the entire stack feature as a unique validated bundle solution for the customers to, easily manage this as if they're managing any other service through Azure Portal.
Perfect. So actually, we have our first question come in. I feel like that's probably a common question from tech community. How does pricing for Azure Virtual Desktop for Azure Stack HCI work, and how should I plan for costs?
All right, so I'll take that first part, and Kashmeen could take the second part. So first of all, with Azure Virtual Desktop, users are entitled to Azure Virtual Desktop. We call that user access rights as part of procuring Windows M365, E3, E5, and a series of other licenses that most users have as part of their M365 licensing. We've got information on that on the web. And then secondly, so that's the AVD user entitlement. The second piece is the Azure Stack HCI charges, and that's related. That is a $10 per physical core per month fee. So if you have if you're basically charged $10 per month for every physical core on that physical device. Or we have Azure Hybrid Rights, which entitle you to convert a Windows Server Data Center license into a Stack HCI license, reducing that fee to $0 per month. And then the third bit is what we call the AVD hybrid meter or the AVD Stack HCI meter, and that is 1 cent per vCPU per hour per month that VM is turned on. So if you have a 4 vCPU machine, that's 4 cents per hour for every hour the VM is turned on. So Kashmeen, if you want to get into the how should I plan for costs, I think that would be a good topic for you to cover.
Yeah, so we have recently introduced AVD as a workload in Azure Stack HCI Sizer. So what is Azure Stack HCI Sizer? It's a web-based tool that helps you estimate your workload requirements. It helps, and it also gives you recommendation for what hardware to buy. Today, Azure Stack HCI is offered in 3 tiers. There's a premier solution, which is more of a turnkey solution that is offered. There's an integrated solution where the OS comes pre-installed, and there's also a more than 200 validated solutions that custom. So based on the customer requirement, they can opt in for one of the 3 solutions. So in this HCI Sizer, you can pick your preferences, and then you can also size your AVD environment by providing, for example, your number of users, what are your concurrency requirements, are you looking for personal desktop versus pooled capabilities, etc., right? And then it will calculate you need X number of VMs, it will recommend your VM configurations, and also it will recommend what hardware to buy based on all the preferences that you have provided. So it will give you, you need to buy 5 nodes of a certain make model of an industry class server, right? So it's gonna give you those recommendation, and you can take those forward and get started with a POC and start that as a baseline for your for planning your requirements.
Perfect. Yeah, and Kashmir, did you say that you can see all the info at the ak.ms/avd/HCI Sizer? Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. That's a blog that has been posted out, and it will give you all the information about how to use that sizer, how to provide your hardware configurations, your hardware preferences, plus how to size your AVD environment.
Okay, perfect. I think both Kashmir and Steve, you mentioned that part of the cost comes from actually running the workloads.
Mm-hmm.
So are there built-in controls in the Azure Virtual Desktop for Azure Stack HCI that helps you manage those?
Yes, there are actually. So we GA'd AVD for Azure Stack HCI back on February 1st. And that 1 cent per vCPU per hour meter that I mentioned didn't go live until April 1st. Now, naturally, like you mentioned, you get charged when that VM is turned on. So the next question customers ask is, how can I control costs? How can I turn VMs on and off without impacting my users? Well, in AVD in Azure, we have 2 capabilities: auto scale, which lets you schedule when VMs turn on and off, as well as start VM on connect, which is essentially when a user logs in, that's when that VM turns on for the first time. So you're not getting charged until the user's actually using the desktop. Now, we just released last week in public preview the ability to use auto scale and start VM on connect with AVD for Azure Stack HCI. You can check out more at ak.ms/avd Stack HCI auto scale. And the nice thing about that capability is it's the exact same workflow as doing it in Azure. The same policies you use for AVD in Azure can also be applied on Stack HCI.
Yeah, one thing I'll call out here is that the service fee for Azure Stack HCI is separate from this. So irrespective of how you are managing your cost for AVD workloads, the Azure Stack HCI service fee is still applicable for the entire cluster.
Got it. Yeah, I do like that. I mean, I think from my understanding experience, it makes so much sense, and it's very exciting that it's the same controls.
Yep.
Whether you're running AVD in the public cloud or in your Azure Stack HCI.
And
that kind of seems like the promise anyways, right?
Yeah, if I could interject there, that's kind of the same model we apply throughout this new capability. You know, when the users log in, they don't need to do a different workflow for logging into Azure Stack HCI. They might not even know their desktop is running on Azure Stack HCI. And the same goes throughout the admin experience. When you're provisioning desktops on Azure Stack HCI, You go through the same exact workflow as you do for provisioning host pools into Azure, except instead of selecting a region, you select the Azure Stack HCI clusters that you manage and have access to. So it's just kind of our kind of design principles as we release new capabilities.
Got it. Yeah, and I think another question that kind of relates to the whole Azure versus Azure Stack HCI is, are Azure AD domain services supported in Azure Stack HCI? It says 23H2, but I guess is Azure AD domain services supported in Azure Stack HCI?
So every Azure Stack HCI cluster needs to be joined to an AD domain service. So yes, it's supported. For joining AVD session host, today we only support joining to ADDS service. Joining to Entra ID join of VMs is not supported yet.
Yeah, I think the crux of this question is more on because Azure has an Azure service for Azure AD domain services. And so I know that in public cloud, there are limitations onto how many times you can have that service create and run a domain controller for you in the public cloud. So
Right.
I guess, do you know does that extend to HCI, Azure Stack HCI as well? Are you able to tell Azure Domain Services to create and manage a domain controller there, or should customers be running their own domain controllers
Yeah.
for this?
So for running Azure Stack HCI cluster, for deploying a cluster, customers should be maintaining their own AD domain controller as part of the deployment process.
Yeah, I'll say the Azure AD domain services service will work, but then you get into the should you use it, because that's
Right.
the service hosting in Azure. And when you have Stack HCI clusters on premises, the full on-prem domain provides capabilities and redundancy and that close network proximity that will make the user experience a little better. So can you? Yes. Should you? You should think about it.
Got it. Okay, so yeah, so for the specific question, it still only deploys and manages it into Azure, public
Right.
cloud, but you can still connect them. But at that point, you're already running this workload closer to on premise. Why would you create that dependency?
Right.
All right, cool. Thank you. Thanks for that clarification. Question from tech community. What is the max scalability for Azure Stack nodes? Can we still go with max of 16 nodes per cluster?
Yeah, that is correct. So Azure Stack HCI is supported from 1 node to 16 nodes, and that's also applicable for 23H2. However, there may be certain limitations on different, for example, network configurations or network requirements, which are required for certain nodes. But yeah, it goes from 1 node to 16 nodes in terms of supportability.
All right, perfect. Yeah, and folks asking questions, please continue to follow up and ask additional questions so we can get those answered for you. Maybe this is a naive question on my end, but I know that we've been releasing the Windows 10 Enterprise multi-session on the Azure Public Cloud for years now. Is that image, can customers deploy that the Enterprise multi-session image onto Azure Stack HCI?
Yes, they can. Yep, Windows 10 and 11 multi-session are both available. If you go through the flow, you'll see that single session is not available as a marketplace image to download, but we are adding that, or it's there already. Kushmeen might actually be able to tell us a little bit more there. And then as part of that, we do have the ability to activate Windows 11 multi-session and 10 multi-session via Azure Stack HCI.
Yeah, that is correct. So today we offer a curated list of Azure Marketplace images. So between Windows Windows Server Azure Edition and Windows 10 and Windows 11 Enterprise multi-session images, and you can download them on your cluster and then use them to provision your VMs.
Perfect. Yeah, and then I guess speaking of which, of creating the VMs on Azure Stack HCI, in Azure Public Cloud, you're able to turn on security features like VTPM for the VMs, trusted launch, and then I think the newest one is the confidential computing. which of those security features, if any, are supported for VMs on Azure Stack HCI?
So trusted launch VMs are supported on Azure Stack HCI with 23H2 release. Confidential VMs are not supported yet. So AVD also supports trusted launch VMs on Stack HCI just outside of the host pool provisioning workflow. So you'll have to create your VMs first and then register them to your host pools.
And we are working on adding trusted launch support to the portal for AVD. It's just you have to do it outside the portal provisioning and then manually register the VMs today. But definitely a high priority item for us is adding trusted launch VMs to the portal.
Right. Got it. Okay, cool. I guess while we're on the topic of the VMs, can Azure Stack HCI, can you create GPU-based VMs?
Yes, absolutely. So GPUs are supported, or GPU resources are supported on Azure Stack HCI, both in DDA pass-through or GPU partitioning, where you can slice up a single GPU and assign a single partition to your VMs, right? However, this experience of managing your GPU resources is outside of Azure portal. So you can use Windows Admin Center or your PowerShell tooling for that. Once your AVD session hosts are created on Stack HCI, you can go back to Windows Admin Center, for example, and assign GPU resources to those session host VMs and take advantage of GPUs if you have a graphic intensive applications that you're running, for example.
Okay, perfect. That is really cool. I did not know that. So, we have a couple of questions that came in. Kushman, this is probably for you from LinkedIn. Does the HCI sizer tell me broadly what to configure, or does it give me specifics based on devices?
So your Stack HCI sizer will give you a hardware recommendation in terms of number of nodes you need to manage the workload, right? To manage X amount of VMs. It's not going to give you how to configure it, but it's mostly giving you an estimation of what to buy, basically.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. So for folks that posted on LinkedIn, continue asking questions if you have additional ones on the sizer. Cool. Thanks, Kushmin. Another question from Tech Community. I'm sorry if I missed this. Can I run this on-prem?
So just to answer that question, you can, that is what Azure Stack HCI is. It is your on-prem instance for hosting virtual machines, in this case, Windows virtual machines on premises, managed by Azure. So AVD remains in Azure. The service is still in Azure. Our VMs are still on premises. And then Stack HCI is also managed via Azure Arc and other Azure capabilities hosted in Azure. So yes, you can run it on-prem. But for AVD in particular, you do absolutely need to be connected to Azure at all times for users to be able to log in. Kushmin, if you want to get into the Stack HCI bit there.
Right. So as Steve mentioned, right, Azure Stack HCI, it's an on-prem system that you can access and you can manage through Azure portal. From a connectivity perspective, Stack HCI cluster itself can stay disconnected for a max duration of 30 days. You'll be able to continue using local tooling for managing your workloads which are running. After 30 days, your cluster goes out of policy and you won't be able to provision new workloads on the cluster. Any existing workload that's already running will continue to run without any issues. But every 30 days, the cluster needs to be connected through Azure portal so that it can transfer all the required information, billing information, metadata information to cloud for the service to be able to work seamlessly.
So just to double click on that. So Kushmin, you mentioned that for the Azure Stack HCI setup in general, there's an availability for offline, but up to 30 days. But Steve, you mentioned specifically for Azure Virtual Desktop, it has to be online. Is that because the Azure service, that Azure Public is actually receiving the connections and kind of telling them where to go, so like it has to be online?
Yeah, good question. So there's kind of two components or two high-level workflows when it comes to AVD. There's the first part, which is the connecting, the authenticating, brokering, connecting. So Steve logs in, this authenticates the AVD service, determines what I have access to, presents them, and then I click on the icon I want to log into. It launches the session. So after that connection is established, you need the connection to Azure for that first bit, the connecting and brokering. The second part, staying connected, uses the RDP protocol to connect the user's client to the session host, in this case hosted on Stack HCI. I should say in the last, I actually don't know when we released RDP short path, but that's a UDP based version of the traditional RDP protocol. And now with the older TCP based reverse connect protocol with AVD, when you connected to a session host, that connection, that RDP connection, was always routed back through the AVD gateway to and from the client and session host. That's not an optimal scenario for Stack HCI, because when you're routing the connection, you might be sitting right next to your Stack HCI node. You don't want that connection routed back up to Azure. So we take advantage of RDP short path, which is a UDP-based direct connection to and from the session host to the client. So as long as you are using RDP short path, the user will stay connected if you lose connection to Azure. It's the brokering piece that fails if you lose that connection.
Got it. And is that so for short path? I know for the public cloud instance of Azure Virtual Desktop, you typically have to configure that on the host pool or the VMs. Is that still a manual configuration for Azure Stack HCI?
No, actually, short path is the default for both AVD and Azure and Stack HCI.
Oh, perfect.
So we will attempt that by default and then fall back to the legacy or the older TCP based reverse connect protocol if short path fails for whatever reason.
Okay, perfect. So then it's not really additional steps then. Okay.
Yeah, you just need to, as part of deploying AVD for Stack HCI, you need to validate that short path is in use, and you can do that through the client. There's a connection info panel that tells you that info, and if you log in and see that's not happening, then you should definitely troubleshoot that as part of deploying this to users.
Right. Yeah, that's definitely something that you can still go without, but really you should solve that issue as soon as possible for the best user connection. Yeah, I mean, I've used short path in my connections, and it just makes everything better, because it's not trying to do like essentially a double hop of a hosted gateway service and then the VM. It's just, well, actually you can connect to the VM directly. It's faster.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Sweet. We have a couple questions on, let's see, from SciX on Tech Community. I have on-prem hardware with me already, recently bought top of the line. Can I just use the existing hardware and put Azure Stack HCI on it?
So the short answer to that is that Azure Stack HCI is supported on a curated list of hardwares that Microsoft has very closely tested out with hardware partners. You can go to HCI catalog and browse through all the available solutions there and see what you have is already supported as part of Stack HCI. And that information is available in Stack HCI catalog. So you can go to so you'll be able to go to aka.ms/HCI catalog to get more details on that. Okay,
perfect. Yeah, I feel like that was a hidden question of the one that Steve previously answered about being able to use on-prem. So I'm glad we asked and clarified that too. A question that's posted on X. Can I mix Azure and Azure Stack HCI session hosts in the same host pool?
No. If somebody is interested in that, we would love to hear about it. I would love to get that feedback either on X or however the question was posted.
Yeah, I would also be very curious about that. I feel like in Azure Virtual Desktop world, I feel like we've had, at least I've heard different requests of wanting to have a host pool just span different geos of let's say you're a salesperson, you're traveling everywhere, but you want to connect to your desktop that's closest to you, or to a pool desktop that's closest to you, so you can check in and do that stuff and not have to do it locally. So I feel like I've seen a couple apps for host pools to be geo-distributed, though
Yes.
currently we advise on I don't think uniformity is the word, a homogeneous pool.
Well, I think what we're really hearing is customers just want to log into the best experience they possibly can, and how do we make that easy for them?
Yeah. So whoever posts that on X, please do. We are hosting this on Tech Community. If you want to hop on over and add more information there, or we do have different feedback channels. Stephen, Kushmi, do we have a specific feedback channel for AVD on Azure Stack HCI, or should we just redirect folks to the Azure Virtual Desktop feedback channel?
Kushmi, you want to?
Yeah, I think we should redirect everyone to the Azure Virtual Desktop feedback loop to gather all the product features, any feedback on new features that you want to see, any gaps you see between AVD in Stack HCI versus in Azure, right? So we are happy to get more feedback from everyone and improve the product experience.
Perfect. So yeah, whoever posted this, please comment and add this feedback, because you're not the only one, and we want to make sure we get all the feedback heard. So again, that's ak.ms/Azure Virtual Desktop feedback. All right. I love that we're getting so many questions. This is great. From either Ali or Ali on LinkedIn. Is there a test drive where I can use this product before buying?
So for Azure Stack HCI itself, for evaluation purposes, so you can use a virtualized environment on top of Windows Server or even Windows 10, 11 with Hyper-V and check out basically feature capabilities. You can also use HCI box. There would be some fee associated with it, but HCI box can also be used to explore Azure Stack HCI. One thing I do want to call out here is that when an Azure Stack HCI cluster gets deployed and registered to Azure, it is free for first 60 days, and the billing will start from the 61st day. So that's another thing to keep in mind. If you already have hardware that is compatible with Azure Stack HCI, you may want to explore that route as well.
And just keep in mind the billing meter for the AVD for Azure Stack HCI, consumption-based meter we talked about earlier, will start billing immediately if you turn on a VM. So make sure you configure auto scale and start VM on Connect if you're trying this out at home.
Awesome. Let's see, another question from Ernie on Tech Community. What is the best way for customers to provide feedback to the product group about this stuff? Oh, look, we just mentioned that. So yeah, either we caught your question late or you destroyed. The best way to provide feedback is going to be through our Azure Virtual Desktop channel. So that's going to be the ak.ms/Azure Virtual Desktop feedback. So if it's specific for Azure Virtual Desktop for Azure Stack HCI, tag it with Azure Stack HCI, or if it applies for both, then that also works. So perfect. Another question from Sean on Tech Community. If the session host can only join Active Directory and not Entra ID, does this mean we have to manage AVD users by AD group policies, and we can't use Intune to manage policy settings?
Oh, okay. That's a spiderweb of a question. So you can use cloud native identity, user identities with this capability. But so I think you could use Intune, but you would still need the group policies for managing the session hosts. I believe. You're getting into an area that I'm not as deep on as I'd like to be honest with you. So that
because basically with Intune, Intune does not require Entra ID join devices. Intune can work with hybrid joined devices natively, because it has to have essentially a device identity to tie to and reflect changes and show the compliance status. So if you use Microsoft Intune, just the cloud service, then you can use Entra ID. But then there's some stuff that you can do with systems config manager, where I think config manager, you can put it into some sort of co-management state with Intune. I'm definitely not an expert on config manager, but the general answer to your question is you can use Intune and cloud services to manage the policies, whether it's the Intune settings catalog or it's some of the group policy stuff you migrate, but you can use Intune and for that.
Thanks, Christian. Appreciate the assist there.
It's always so interesting because as this question reflects it, like Azure Virtual Desktop spans so many different things about Microsoft in terms of device identity, user identity, how you actually manage devices, sometimes the apps that are allowed or you can install, MSIX, Windows 10 versus Windows 11, Windows Server. I guess it's just everything. So definitely appreciate the questions. Let's see. Maybe actually, if we take a look at that question one more time, Steve. One other thing I wanted to ask a question on is, if the VMs that you create on Azure Stack HCI, so those ones are domain joined to capacity. They can't be pure Entra ID joined, but domain joined, and then they can be essentially be made hybrid joined with the right configuration. From my understanding, you still can only log in to domain or hybrid joined VMs with a user account that was created in like on-prem AD and then synced to Entra ID. So I don't believe you can sign into those AVD VMs with a cloud-only identity.
Okay.
Does that sound about right? And or should we just like follow up and
I think we need to follow up in an AMA about identity. It's a large topic.
Yeah. So we'll follow up on that one. So thank you for the question. I think you mentioned specifically Intune, but I wanted to make sure we cover our bases with actually the logon as well. So we'll follow up on that. I want to bring that to the room. What else? Okay. So from Robert, I've successfully deployed multiple nested Azure Stack HCI 23H2, I guess in a mature test lab, but keep pulling my hair lately when deploying AVD. Everything works from the same logical network using the same on-prem AD, parentheses VM connected to AD and Azure Arc installed. Just the AVD deployment stalls at CustomScriptExtension with machine is not connected. Any ideas?
I will take a pass at this, and Kushmi, please jump in.
Yeah.
And this is you'll see Kushmi and I try to work this together, but that error could be a few things. I will say we've got some known issues, and just yesterday we published an updated ARM template that has a potential fix for that issue. And we are working on adding a fix to the portal as well. I can't say if that'll fix your exact issue, but there was essentially, we added a new parameter to better support 23H2 and resolve the issue you might be having. I don't know, Kushmin, if you have anything to add there.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add there is that there has been a known issue with VM extensions on HCI VMs. So make sure that the Stack HCI version that you're running on is either 2402 or above. There has been a known issue with 2311, which had issues with Arc Agent installation and VM extensions. And also what Steve mentioned, there is an ARM template that has been updated recently that is potentially going to fix this issue if it's the same issue. And then AVD portal will also get that fixed pretty soon.
I think what I'll do is, Christian, I'll defer to you here, but I think it makes sense for me to find that ARM template and post a link to it in the tech community.
Yeah, so we can definitely follow up on that question. This question was, I actually don't remember where this question was, but when we get information, we can go ahead and link to
Great.
it. Perfect. So then, let's see, because yeah, you're mentioning the ARM template there. Okay. Maybe we'll get back to that. There's another question on X, and I think it relates to the auto-scale stuff you're talking about, Steve. It says, can I scale for holidays or other periods of downtime?
Yes, you can. The auto scale capability doesn't have like a holiday awareness, but you can create a schedule in advance of the holiday to control your power states of your virtual machines in both Azure and HCI on particular days.
Yeah, because that was my question was, I know even for my own work calendar, I have to someone has to go and create a holiday calendar for me to subscribe to. I imagine the same for autoscale.
Yep.
So thank you for confirming that. So actually I want to go back. Yeah, I want to go back to the issue that we're having, the ARM template for the potential fix for the machine is not connected. We did create just a quick link for ak.ms/ARM template. So definitely, Robert, if you're still listening, please go ahead and check that out. Or others, if other folks were hitting that same issue, please go check that out to hopefully remediate that issue.
And if you're not in a position to use the ARM template and you need to wait for the portal, we are working on that fix now. I wish I could give you a time frame from when it'll be there, but just the nature of deployments, it's hard for me to do that, but we're working on it.
Awesome.
And don't forget the bit Kushmin mentioned about updating the HCI cluster if needed.
Yeah, and I think another way around if ARM templates are not accessible or cannot be used is you can create your VMs on the cluster outside of AVD provisioning, right? And then register them to your host pools for the time being.
Right. Perfect.
Yep. So there's a VM provisioning for a VM in Azure outside of AVD. You can also go to the Arc VM or the Arc blades, the Stack HCI blades, and create a VM there, and then manually add it to the AVD host pool, and that will work around the issue as well.
Sweet. Okay, cool.
Good call, Kushmin.
A question from X. Does this solution support Windows Server 2022?
So the solution, Azure Virtual Desktop on Azure Stack HCI is only supported on Stack HCI solution, right? So from a host perspective, you cannot run AVD on Windows Server 2022. Steve, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, you can run Windows Server 2022 AVD session hosts as VMs on Azure Stack HCI. You just need to make sure you have an RDS cal for users or devices connecting to that VM.
In terms of the session hosts, because you already confirmed earlier that you can use the Windows 10 11 Enterprise multi-session just like you can in public cloud. In terms of Windows Server, is it just the same support lifecycle because it's supported, it works across? Is there any difference in which versions of OSs you can deploy on Azure Stack HCI VMs versus Azure VMs or session hosts?
No, there won't be any difference in what guest OSs you can run in Azure versus Azure Stack HCI when it comes to AVD. Through Azure Marketplace integration on your cluster, you can pull down images from Azure Marketplace, and then we also provide Windows Server Azure Edition as one of the server images that you can pull down on your cluster and use them.
Okay, perfect. So I think we sort of were touching on this question earlier. I guess from what you've seen from different customers, what would be a common use case for running AVD workloads on Azure Stack HCI, either separately or combined with a deployment in the public cloud?
Sure. So we're seeing a lot of use cases where customers have some data that needs to stay on premises and they need their desktop to be close to that data. So it could be regulatory data. It might be a commercial entity that operates in a region where that country says all data you generate must stay in the country. So therefore they can't use an Azure region outside that country. So they deploy Azure Stack HCI clusters close by, deploy AVD on top of it, and their data stays in country. Or it could be a government agency that has similar requirements. It could also be the case where they're doing they're running really high performant workloads that might need a GPU, and they can't risk any sort of data loss or latency between that connection, so they want to stay close to the data. Or it could be that there's the latency topic, or it could be just they're not ready to move to Azure, so they want to deploy Stack HCI on premises while they validate things on-prem, and then they can move to Azure later. I don't know, Kashmir, if you've got anything to add there.
Yeah, and the only other thing would be maybe the customer has planned to move to Azure, right? But then for certain applications or certain user population that for the reason Steve just mentioned, needs to stay on-prem. So this will fill that gap. And from a user perspective, they'll get a consistent solution with Azure Virtual Desktop in Azure as well as on Stack HCI.
And I think I know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask it anyways. I assume you can run session desktops and remote apps. Like there's no difference in terms of that user experience.
That is correct. You can run remote apps or full desktops on Stack HCI. You can run them. You can have a user logging into a remote app that's on-prem while their desktop is in Azure, or vice versa. Yep.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so folks, let's see. I don't think we have any more questions yet, but please keep those coming in. Otherwise, we might wrap up a tad bit early today. While we have those, potential last questions coming in, Kashmir and Steve, any call to action, any closing thoughts you have for customers that are either running AVD and Azure Stack HCI today or who are thinking about it?
Sure. I would say just please go try it out. Like Kashmir mentioned a few ways to do that. Definitely give that a shot with the nested virtualization solution or the HCI box. And if you have any questions, please reach out to your account teams. We love getting feedback. We are getting a lot of feedback right now. Please keep it going.
Yeah, absolutely. Keep testing and let us know what new features you want to see in the product.
Perfect. Yeah, and especially like you mentioned, there's other stuff that's just being worked on that's coming. I love that. I know that we've always, as Microsoft, we've been really attuned to cloud services and updating them, and I love that we're investing in this hybrid solution for customers and continuing to iterate and improve it. So I love that you all, Kashmir and Steve and the team, are focused on that. It looks like actually we do have another question, so thank you for listeners from Richard. As a comment, we have a mature AVD deployment, but only servicing users in offices that have all data in Azure. So this, parentheses, AVD for Azure Stack HCI, will fill the gap for remaining offices with all local data that have no plans to move data to Azure for these offices due to latency to nearest Azure region. So it sounds like it confirms what you were talking about, Steve.
We are seeing a lot of that.
Yeah.
It's very rare we see we're going to do it all in Azure or all on Stack HCI. It's usually a combination. We definitely encourage people to look at Azure first and use Stack HCI where it's needed.
Yeah, it's going to be a hybrid journey for most customers.
Yep.
Perfect. Oh, another question on Tech Community. When will per user licensing be available, and or when will B2B guest access be available?
Okay, two good questions. I'm not sure when the per user access licensing will be available. We are talking about that right now. That's another one where I'd love to hear more from people, because I think there's a need for that in the Stack HCI use case in particular. The B2B guest question, that will track to the same timelines for AVD and Azure, which I don't have in front of me. So I wish I could give a more precise answer there. I just know we're working on that.
Yeah, Steve, for the B2B one, I also, again, probably for follow-up for us, I know that the B2B access is also directly tied to being able to log in as a cloud-only user.
Yep.
And so, as we huddle and have the identity question, we'll probably have to, put those two together. But yeah.
Yep.
I'm curious, for the per user licensing, either Rudy, who asked, or Steve Kushmin, what would be the scenarios that you would see for the per user licensing?
Yeah, so this is a per user licensing. The use case is the same, whether it's in AVD or Azure. It's essentially, customers who, right now, the user entitlement we mentioned at the start of the call was, M365 E3, E5 licenses for users. That's traditionally like within your own company, but sometimes we have ISVs that might build a solution on top of AVD. And then they provide, a published apps to a second company. And that's where B2B plus per user access pricing comes into play, because you can assign an external identity from that customer's customer to the AVD host pool, and then charge that user without having to complicate things with an M365 license. Again, that's not my day job, so hopefully I covered that right. So.
Perfect. And then another question, I think, Kashmir, this one might be for you. From the tech community, can I configure Azure Stack HCI simulation on Azure just to test how to configure it and how it works? Any step-by-step guide will help.
Yeah, I believe the nested virtualization solution would work here, right? You're spinning up a VM, a Windows Server VM, and then using nested virtualization to simulate your Stack HCI environment. So that should work on Azure as well, on a VM that's in Azure.
Is that the HCI box that you were talking about earlier?
So HCI box is a turnkey solution, right? That is provided. There is some fee associated with it, but yeah, that can also be used for testing out what Stack HCI is. It's available for 23H2 now.
Okay, got it. So there's HCI box, the ak.ms/HCI box as one option, but separately you're saying that our customers can do the nested virtualization, spin up the VM, and test it out.
Correct.
Yep.
Sweet. Hopefully that helps you for the person that asked it. Cool. Yeah, I guess we're close to time. All right. So Stephen, Kashmeen, thank you again. And for folks that are listening, moral of the story is go try it out and get feedback. From our end, thank you for joining. Our next Windows in the Cloud Ask Microsoft Anything in May will be on May 15th. So continue to check that calendar, save the date, and we'll provide more information on what we'll be covering then. So thank you, everyone. Have a great morning, afternoon, evening, where you're coming from. And enjoy your day. Thank you so much, Kashmir and Steve.
You too, Christian.
Thank you, everyone.